WLRN Video presents.
Welcome to another WLRN interview. My name is April Neault, WLRN Canadian member and unapologetic lover of this beautiful planet of ours. This interview, I jump into a discussion with two amazing women whose unyielding bravery and grassroots approach to caring for women led them both to develop a model to describe the unrecognized horrific acts of torture abuse that happens all over the world to women and children. Despite attempts from torturers to discredit their work and various silencing tactics from peers and women in positions of authority, Jeanne Sarson and MacDonald overcame obstacles to share women's stories, their experiences in developing the non-state torture model, and why this is crucial work. Bravery without risk or fear is just entitlement. We risk something each time we ask a woman to share her story with us. We risk challenging our own beliefs and language. We risk having our peers question our methodology. We risk being ignored, discredited, lied about, defamed, deplatformed, fired, assaulted, and worse. Listening to women and sharing their stories is risky business, but we do this as all feminists must. To stay silent is to admit that there is something wrong with the women being abused and tortured, that they themselves are not worthy of our attention and empathy. We must continue to develop our own language, as Jeanne and Linda have, that adequately describes our experiences, and never under any circumstances should we ever let the oppressor class define us. Women and children are human beings with human experiences, worthy of being heard, believed, understood, and shared. I hope you enjoyed this interview with two Canadian nurses turned authors on their book, Women Unsilenced, Our Refusal to Let Torturers-Traffickers Win. Thank you both for joining WLRN today. Really, honestly, it's truly a privilege to talk to you about such this is an incredible book. It was obviously, I mentioned to you that it was difficult, of course, to get through, but I think it's the difficult things that require our attention for sure. So I'm very happy to introduce Linda MacDonald and Jeanne Sarson to the show. Thank you so much. And the first question that I wanted to talk about was the importance of language. So you write a book, clearly you think that you can, communicate with people using words. And I want to just take a moment to take a little, I had taken several quotes from the book, but I'm just going to use one here. I'm not too sure which one of you said it, but it says, a must for promoting women's safety requires using clear, correct terminology. The women we support did not know they suffered sexualized crimes perpetrated by professionals until these violations were clearly discussed. So obviously, language is really important whenever we're talking about the violations that men do to women and children. And both of you have signed the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. So maybe if you could just talk about language in general and why it was important for you both to sign the declaration from the Women's Human Rights Campaign.
Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, the Women's Human Rights Campaign was important because we're talking about women in the book. We have a few men that we interviewed, but the majority of the conversation and the support is all women. And to think that the word women is being invisibilized in the world just when we're trying to help these women become unsilenced was just unbearable, really. And one night I was looking at the we work quite a bit with the United Nations, and I was looking at the UN women's language around human rights of women, and there was hardly a word of women in the whole document. And I just said, that's it, that's just it's atrocious. I mean, we had to fight to get women in or get men out of the UN Declaration. It was saying the rights of men instead of the rights of human beings, and women had to fight to get human beings there instead of men. So now to think, that was in the 1940s, what, 70, 80 years ago, and we're fighting now to keep women in any documents. It's pretty shocking, really, and bizarre. It's really bizarre. So that was important for me to and I called Jeanne. It was, I don't know, it was late. I saw it late at night, so I think I called her early in the morning. I said, do you want to sign this declaration? We need to sign it, in my opinion. So we signed it right that day together. And then they contacted us right away and asked us if we'd speak on persons against non-state torture. So that was really responsive of them to ask us then to talk about our work.
So,
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Jeanne.
okay, just to expand on that about the value of language, I'm looking at your questions here. Because why it's so important, especially when it comes to victimization, because that's what we were talking about, the issue that the women were vulnerable because they were tortured as children, and they had no experience of boundary rights, if you will, even as a person. So when professionals took advantage of the fact that the women did not understand what was happening to them, because professionals could normalize it too. This is normal. So if nobody puts right language, like this is rape, or this is torture, or this is assault, they did not know. So in order for them to develop safety, they had to know the language that described their experiences or their ordeals. So it was very clear to us, because I remember when I was talking to Elizabeth that she did not know that the professional was assaulting her, raping her, because nobody had used that word. Everybody, like when Sarah said to her physician, it's kind of rough, it's kind of tough, and the physician doesn't ask why. I guess the word Sarah used was bad. No, the physician didn't ask, what does bad mean? She just said, it will get better, but it doesn't get better. So we have to be very, very clear to not assume that the language that is coming to us, that we understand what the person is saying. Because when we asked Sarah to describe bad, then we got understanding of what she was telling us. So that, to me, is throughout the book, that was important. Language, how we use language, how we define the victimization, respectful of what the women were telling us, not what we assumed, but what they were telling us. That was the importance of language. And of course, that took us to the Declaration, as Linda said, and women's sex-based rights.
And of course, we've been at this, as you know, April, you've heard this a million times. I keep saying this, but 28 years ago, when we started listening to Sarah, I think it was the third session, and we knew right away we were hearing torture. And so we started looking up anything about torture, women being tortured. Nothing anywhere, hardly, just nothing, just like a desert. It was really shocking because it was so obvious to us that's what we were listening to, torture. And so we started talking about it as torture, and people kept telling us that's too strong a word, you shouldn't use that word. Non-state torture is too complex a term, women will never understand it. All this dismissing of the reality that we were really listening to torture. And we just became more adamant to use the word torture because, my God, if women are being tortured, we shouldn't be calling it anything but torture. And to look back in history, we've been tortured since the beginning of time. And yet we're still really not claiming that reality. It's not a great reality to claim. I mean, it's horrific. But if we don't say, you know, we've had enough of being tortured, it's going to continue another 200 or 300 years before women stand again. So we were very adamant, as many times as we were dissuaded from using torture or non-state torture, that we would use it. And we said, you know, people grow into any word. Harassment wasn't a word at one time. Rape wasn't even a word at one time. And we grew into those words, so we can certainly grow into torture or non-state torture. So we stayed with it despite all the negativity.
And I think
there's so many.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Jeanne. No, go ahead.
I'll just add one little statement there. Around the issue of respecting women as a person, I think much of the resistance came from other women. You know, I can still see this woman standing there, you know, it's an image that has just kind of stayed with me when we were talking about it. And she just looked at me with contempt and said, assault is good enough. It's not good enough. You know, as women, if we're going to respect other women's human rights, which the Declaration is about, then we have to respect what it is they're telling us they're surviving. So the misogyny that women can internalize and express and contribute to other women's silence, this has to be also exposed, you know, because we are responsible for how we shape the culture that women and children are living in. So that was the other aspect that I wanted to say.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to identify who it is that is resisting the terminology, right? Like, you know, in many ways, I feel like women are just afraid. Like, we're really afraid to put those words to what happens to women. I do want to talk about why it is that you feel it's important to have a feminist lens.
If you don't have a feminist lens, almost everything on that column of non-state torture would never be listed anywhere that happened to women. You know, electric shocking is one that people are always really horrified about. They don't realize how much electric shocking women and girls endure in the home or in a hotel or in a camp somewhere. You know, there'd be rape, and there'd be maybe game rape and the strangulation, which we're hearing more about now. Strangulation was never talked about really until the last probably 5 years. But all of the rest of the crimes, you'd never hear them talked about if we don't have a feminist lens. Women would still be just talking about how it was assault and never mention those other crimes. And women always, when they come to us, they say, well, we know you know, so we can tell you everything. They've held back a lot of those other atrocities that have happened to them because they were afraid people wouldn't believe them, or they were told that they were lying, or that they were mentally ill. So they were reluctant to tell all those things that happened to them. So a feminist lens really turns the light on all of those other forms of torture that women and girls are enduring. And it's crucial. Without a feminist lens, we're still going to have a patriarchal masculine story about warring. And even in our country of Canada, when we tried to get the law changed, we had a feminist woman, Minister of Justice. And she said that the law was adequate the way that it was, that assault was good enough for women. That was a real shock to me, because I thought that maybe she would have, because we tried different, you know, ministers. She wasn't the first one that we talked to, but we thought, well, now we've got a woman feminist Minister of Justice. Maybe she'll really get it, but no, she stayed with how important it is to keep state torture is higher than anything that happens because it's international and the international status of our country, and really relegated women to calling everything that they endure on that column assault. And that's not assault. If it's torture for men and some women in state torture, It's torture for women and girls and non-state torture. It doesn't matter whether it's in the house or an embassy. It's the exact same act. And with a feminist lens, it's exposed as what's really the truth of it. It brings the truth to what torture is, the feminist lens does.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I would add to that, if we can't, like if a woman can't express the types of victimization she has survived, it's like the culture she lives in silences her value as a person. Because if I have to keep a secret, it's like there's something wrong with me as a woman, that something has been done to me, that I should carry the shame, I should carry the guilt, I should be somehow held responsible, which is, again, extreme patriarchal misogyny that we will tie into if we allow the culture and the legal system, especially, because the thing about law, if there's a law there, at least it starts to create awareness that torture can happen anywhere, and there's no limitation of who could be a torturer. But the thing about torturers try to destroy the personhood of the woman they torture. That's the intent. And when society goes along with that, we're condoning the non-personhood of women and children, in my opinion. Because here again, we go back to language and the fact that either language applies to all of us equally or it does not. And if it doesn't apply to us equally, then we're in a culture again, and we're talking Canadian culture because that's where we started. The inequality is cemented in there. And Linda and I have just not been willing to agree with that. So all the resistance that we've had, we just have marched forward with a feminist lens. And when you bring up the fact, the work that you did, and the fact that there were probably women and children who had been tortured, and because, like Linda said, it was just nothing there. There was no language for it, so that person wasn't understood. I worked in the school system, and I can remember still this one child that when he was explaining to me in his own language, he was just a 5-year-old, and I reported it to child protection. I just knew by what I was sharing that the receiver of my message was not understanding. Mm-hmm. They did not understand that I was telling them that there was a suggestion that this was a group process, and the child's language was identifying acts of torture that only a child didn't have the language, but he was trying. So that's the other issue around resistance. If we don't have the language, if we don't know that we have to embrace new thoughts, and it doesn't make women wrong, it makes them right. It makes truth-telling a value that in a culture we have to uphold. So for me, I'm puzzled still that, like Linda and I were like whistleblowers. We were blowing the whistle on the silence, that torture was happening in families, that trafficking, the torturers were also traffickers. We were blowing the whistle on that reality. And as we know, whistleblowers are usually beaten up in the process. So that was a reality that we were faced too. You know, we knew we were on many times on the edge of trying to be discredited. So it's just very important that we know that women are persons. And the other thing about language and the question you've just asked is many women were told they were being punished. And that's why I disagree with the word disorder. I know I'm a little ahead of your question. Because being tortured is never punishment. But if we buy into that, then it still makes the women or the little girl responsible for the torturers. So the misogyny of the language, we have to erase. That torture can be perpetrated by any individual. It should not be just the right of men to be protected.
Absolutely. And I mean, we don't ever measure what we don't value. And of course, women and children, I think historically have been seen as the property, right, of men in this culture. So they haven't been valued really as persons, like you said. So of course, I think it's very important. Who did you write this book for?
For everyone.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah,
everyone. Every person. I don't imagine it'd be too many perpetrators read it, but I think the torturers are unredeemable, but everybody else. Yeah.
Absolutely. Pathologizing women. So let's kind of jump into that. So you both chose, so in 1993, you receive a phone call at approximately 11:15 at night, or it was approaching midnight, wasn't it?
11:11.
And yeah, and so this woman who you've called Sarah, you pick up the phone and you listen to her, and that's what you do, and you decide not to bring her into the system, basically, right? You choose to care for Sarah outside of the system. And I wonder if both of you could talk just about the importance of that decision and not pathologizing women.
I'll go back to it, just one little step. When you said, who did we write it for? I just want to say that many times Linda and I just knew that it was very difficult for us because there was no support anywhere. So we were breaking ground over and over again. And like we say in the book, we went undercover because we knew the system would not tolerate what the caring we were giving, even though we talk about nursing and the types of care that nursing can give. It's still, how we care is still boxed in. It's boxed in over here, and you put little boundaries around it. And if you go beyond that, it doesn't matter if the person is getting better, you're breaking the little box, so you're in trouble again. So writing the book for us, and we talked about it many times, was we didn't want not only the women who were victimized as little girls or as women, but also the carers that really did care. We did not want it to be so hard for them. And we did not want it to be so difficult for young women who are developing relationships not to have the knowledge that might protect them. So I think that was a very ethical conversation we had many times. So when you asked who did we write it for, it was so no one else would have to struggle like we struggled. If people at least were leaving, opening the door. So it was caring about them. So why we chose to care like we did?
And why we chose not to not
Yeah, I don't think we had a choice, really, because we knew that Sarah was not going to survive in the system. Like she said at that 1111 phone call, that she was going to die in 4 days. I mean, we didn't understand what that meant. I mean, it took us, and it took Sarah many years to really figure totally what that meant. But very quickly, when Sarah came for support, we just knew that 45 minutes was not going to do anything. And like we said in the book, it took us 97, I think. So that was 4 years before we found out that what we were doing was indeed professional caring, but the system still would not have accepted it. So why we would call it a response? Because it didn't, part of it is in relation, like I talk in the book, to my mother's experience of going for help and being insulin shocked, because nobody asked the question, what kind of violence or were you experience violence? So that's the pathologization of women. So Linda and I would talk about, here we have this horrific reality. What do we expect? How do we expect people to respond? I mean, in the war, in the First World War, they killed soldiers if they went into post-traumatic stress responses because of the horror they were seeing and being exposed to. So now in 1993, women were told that they were disordered. Nobody was listening to them. They were medicated. They were electric shocked as therapy. It was an injustice. We could not treat women like the system was treating them, not listening to them, not believing them, calling them, putting labels on them as being disordered or bizarre in some way. Ethically, we just couldn't do it. So that was our decision to stay with Sarah and go underground.
And so many of the women, I mean, they hear voices because they're their perpetrators' voices. They would have been diagnosed as schizophrenic or the borderline personality or DID because they, would disassociate or go into flashbacks or all kinds of things. So the other point is that we've practiced from an equality-based model. So that means that I'm equal to the woman that I'm supporting. So for me, growing up, I knew that I was not mentally ill. I knew that my father was wrong. He was violent and he was wrong. And it had nothing to do with mental illness. It didn't matter to me who told me that they thought it was mental illness. I didn't believe it. So if I believe that about myself, how do I then have the authority to look at another woman who's had violence farther down the scale, but still violence, and tell her that she's mentally ill? I mean, that just goes against my whole belief system. I might as well tell myself I'm mentally ill too then. It's just, violence is not a mental illness. Violence is a crime and a human rights violation. So I would never look at another woman, regardless of what type of violence she endured, and think that she's mentally ill. Never. That just goes against every fundamental principle I have in my life.
And I think we have to start recognizing that those are normal human responses. Women are human. We have responses that are completely normal to traumatic events like that. Mm-hmm. Dissociation is a survival technique. Women need to do that to survive those terrible ordeals. We know this. This culture has a long history of pathologizing women. But it was so great.
A lot of money They make a lot of money pathologizing women too. It's very profitable.
And
I mean, these are supposed to be the professionals, and oftentimes, and I'm not saying that all of it is terrible, but oftentimes the women that we meet have like just multiple diagnoses, right? You know what I mean? Like nobody can get it straight. We don't really know what she has, but we're going to slap a label because they sit with her for 6 sessions, and all of a sudden they know exactly what's going on instead of actually listening to the woman's trauma, right?
Yeah, we just saw them as women. You're a woman, and tell us what happened. You're not a diagnosis, you're not your responses. You're a woman.
Yeah.
You just start there as them as persons. It's pretty simple if you get rid of all the smoke and mirrors around it.
I know.
I'm back to language again, because I tell you, writing the book, it's like almost every sentence I had to think about it, to think of what the language, how it was being used, how I was using it, what it meant. Now, you mentioned, April, trauma. For me, you see, I have to be very honest. I struggle with using that word in the context, because I think if we use trauma, we forget that she's been victimized, that there was a crime that caused the trauma. And I worry that in some ways, if we forget to name the victimization, you've been victimized and you have a response, which is the trauma response to the crime that you suffered, that in some ways that enables the devaluation of women, but it also hides the perpetrator, because they're the ones that are responsible for the trauma that the woman is suffering. And I just think that patriarchy and the misogyny of patriarchy coats so much. It coats the law, it coats how the structures are, it coats policies that we live in, that guide our lives every day. So I just want to make that point, because I'm back to the value of language and how it can either minimize or distort or support the perpetrators too. So I do have concern, because sometimes when we've written, submitted articles, we do get back, why do you write women who have been victimized instead of victimized women? It's always that struggle of how to make us think more clearly, I guess, at least for Linda and I. We had many conversations around this, because it's like, you say victimized women, it's like putting, the woman has to be put first. A woman who has been victimized, the woman who something has happened to, the woman who, whatever. Like Linda said, we really support the fact that personhood womanhood cannot be invisibilized. So the language here again is important to me.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, I don't think you use the term trauma in the book at all.
Yeah, we've used traumatization, but always, victimization and the trauma responses that she has from the victimization. But we've been very, very clear, like we said, non-state torture, victimization, traumatization, informed care. That we have to know the type of crime. I mean, that's pretty standard. Really, I mean, from the time you're little, if you have a new bike and somebody steals it, then you start crying. We know why they're crying, because somebody stole their bike. So for women, when they've been tortured, we have to know that the women's response is because of the crime, the torture that they survived. And it must never be so that the language makes them feel that somehow it's their fault, that somehow they should bear some responsibility or shame. I guess that was a fundamental principle that just carried through the book for us all the time.
And the thing that I learned, which I never in my life ever dreamed it would be possible, but I didn't realize that trauma-informed care means that you don't talk about the crime. I just assumed that trauma-informed care meant that you talked about what happened to you and then how it traumatized you. But when I found out that women were being told, we don't want to hear about what happened to you here, we're only dealing with your trauma, it horrified me, really, when I realized that all this trauma-informed care that we're putting everywhere in the world means that women can't tell what happened to them. That's not right. And especially not right with torture, because all the research shows that in order for a woman or a man to heal from torture, they have to tell their story. That's fundamental in the healing, because the goal of a torturer is to destroy the person's sense of self. That's how torture is different from abuse. Abuse is to control a person, and torture is to destroy their sense of self. That's their ultimate goal. So your sense of self can be so fragile in the torturing if you don't tell those stories to reclaim all the shattering that's happened. Talking about the trauma will do you no good, ever. You have to reclaim oneself, and that's why our work was victimization, traumatization, informed care. But I'm just horrified now to think that all the trauma-informed care in the world means that women are told, probably men too, we don't want to hear about your victimization here. It's just mind-blowing to me. I couldn't imagine that I'd be silent about what happened to me. And we're not gonna heal that way either. We're just going to be kept in talking about the trauma.
So why do you think that they've set it up this way? I mean, is this just a way to, again, invisibilize women? And
well, I don't know if it's concerted way to silence the crime, or whether it's a missed pathology. I don't know which it is. I hope it's just a missed pathology and not concerted effort, but I really don't know, because I don't work in fields where, I don't work in the psychology field or the psychiatry field or the social worker field, but with nursing, we just knew that we had to listen. I mean, they were desperate to tell, and that's what we did. We listened first and then helped them figure out what happened and why and what to do about it.
I guess if we're valuing the freedom of language, that women need to know that if they're tortured, they can speak. If they don't want to, that's fine too. But we need to have the freedom, because Linda and I, when Sarah came, we realized the horror we were listening, but for her, it was just normal. So we weren't going to tell her that it was torture we were listening to. She had to unravel enough of her life to start understanding exactly what happened to her. So I think if we're going to respect, and it is a human right to have the freedom to tell your truth around language, the freedom not to be subjected to torture. So it's just to know that women have the right to tell their truth. And if it's torture they want to talk about, fine. If they don't want to talk about it, that's fine too. But at least we have to say that your right is there. Your right to speak what you want to say is there. And we have the right and the responsibility to listen, and to listen with understanding. So if we don't understand the degree of victimization that can occur, then I worry that how are we going to understand with respect and dignity of those who want to tell us the whole truth? That can't happen. And like you say, the perps get off freely because the language doesn't hold them to account. So that's why in the book we have the MO. We knew we had to understand the MO of the perpetrators, because if we understood the MO, then it helped us understand the women's responses. Like if you're tied to a tree and you're taken there and horrible things happen to you, then it makes sense to understand, well, if a woman says, I'm really scared of the woods and the tree, like we did with Sarah, we had to help her understand that it's not the tree that's the perp, it's the people who use the tree that is the perp. So here again, it's like your first question, the importance of language. It seems that we can't escape it if we're going to move forward with equality for women and girls.
You are listening to WLRN.
Absolutely. And I think just even as authors, or, both of you have done public speaking, you've delivered talks at the UN level. I mean, you have to be confident that whenever you say the word children or child, that everybody in the room understands what it is that you're talking about, right? And it's the same thing with the word woman, which obviously in the current context, has gone through a whole washing cycle. But it's important. Language obviously is very important. But I don't mean to say that language is the only tool, because obviously your work with Sarah involved a lot of charts. It involved her, drawing ordeals and doing them that way, which I thought was just fabulous. I did want to talk a little bit about Sarah and some boundaries that you put on her, and which is going to lead into a question about burnout and perhaps how you have avoided burnout.
Well, I'll speak first about my boundaries. So it was 7 years after I started seeing Sarah with Jeanne that I decided it was time for me to stop working with Jeanne around Sarah, for many reasons. I think the first one was because it didn't matter how I tried to go around it. She'd gotten out of the family and she was safe, but like there was still a lot of healing that she needed to make connections with, but she was safe anyways. And I knew that, safe from the family. But in the relationship with the three of us, Sarah wanted a family and she wanted a mother. And so she was always deferring to Jeanne, and I was kind of on the side, and it never really changed. And so as she got healthier, it still never changed. So I decided, well, I'm giving all this time and I'm overwhelmed with my own family life. It's time for me to leave her with Jeanne, and because she's not accepting me equally in the process anyway, so I'm not really contributing anymore like I was initially when she needed the two of us all the time. And I was just overwhelmed with my daughter, who was a teenager and resistive, and my husband, who wasn't parenting the same as I was. And so there was a lot of family strife, and I just felt if I didn't give something up here, I was going to go down, and then I wouldn't be good to anybody. It wasn't something I wanted to do. I would have liked to stayed working with Jeanne and Sarah and follow it through. And I knew for Jeanne, it meant more work too. I wanted to help her, but I just kept hitting the brick wall with Sarah. So I decided, okay, this is time to leave now. And, it was something I had to really process, because I felt guilty about it. And I felt like I'd abandoned Jeanne in the work and all those things that come up. But eventually I worked it through and know that was the best thing that I could do under the circumstances. So I don't regret it now. And I have reconnected with Sarah in a way that, I don't think she even really remembers a lot of it, really. I think it's just evolved. So, but it was the right timing for me. And so boundaries are really important. You have to know when you're not being effective anymore. And we had other boundaries around if she'd ever gone back to the family, and if children were involved, we told her we'd never work with her again. So that was a shock for her. She didn't expect that. That was a fundamental boundary we had, that no children were going to be harmed anywhere, or she was to be reported. Really, that's where we were, because children need to be safe in all situations, and we weren't going to be part of listening to any stories where she was involved with children being harmed. So that was a huge boundary for us. Those are some of the boundaries. If you want to talk now, Jeanne, about your boundaries.
Yeah, I guess there were so many boundaries,
Mm.
and they had to be constantly reinforced, because Sarah never knew there was such a thing as boundaries. Like if she went to bed at night, she got raped. If the weekend came, they had torture parties. When you have young children, you know that one of the first words a child generally says, at least my experience working with children and babies and toddlers, is no. No. They do this over and over again. And we know that's an MO of pedophiles, if you will. In the grooming, they start dissolving the boundaries until they feel that they can really do harm. So with torturers, they torture very quickly and normalize it. So for the issue of setting boundaries, we did know for the years that Linda and I worked, it was a constant, a constant, this is a boundary. And of course, it would only last maybe a day, and you'd have to say it again. But we understood too that she did not comprehend what we were trying to do. Our behavior had to be consistent repeatedly, so for her to eventually learn through the behavior, because a lot of learning comes through behavior. Just like the boundaries are dissolved by behavior, the perpetrators of grooming, if you will, or the torture for normalizing, because the things we had that we didn't have in the book, because there just wasn't enough room, was how very early Sarah's father and mother started grooming her and victimizing her and her male siblings. So you have to have a lot of patience with boundaries when someone has never, and I'm talking, been tortured, to not know there's boundaries, because it comes over and over again that you have to set them. Now in the book, we set the boundary that we had to challenge Sarah to stop going to the family, because the one thing for Sarah, and it took her a long time, and this is in the book, is to let go of the family. Like, some of us can let go very quickly of a situation, and some of us hang on and hang on and hang on. And I'm not saying that as a negative, but our temperaments do make a difference. Our ability to internalize and understand makes a difference depending on the support we've had, the people around us. Many things can influence that. But very early, we had to challenge Sarah that she stopped going to the family, or we would have to stop. And I don't know if you're referring to that part, April, but what's not in the book is that alleged perpetrators very quickly came in to put malintent and false complaints against us professionally, trying to destroy our profession and our practice. So this would be a way for them to recapture Sarah. So we had to fight professional complaints legally. And all this was in the draft of the first book. It'll have to go into the second now, I think, because of how much everyday corruption there is in dealing with perpetrators of horrific crimes around women and girls. I mean, you know that even in divorce cases, slap suits, you know, that's a tactic. So these perpetrators came after us, and we just knew that if she kept connecting, that they would keep at us, because their intent was to destroy that relationship and to destroy us too. So that created that boundary that we put in, that, Sarah, you have to make up your mind, because we're working day and night, and this is not going to stop, because the more crisis that they built, the more demand came back to Linda and I. So that's why in the book we talk about political cruelty, because as much as Linda and I worked, and as much later when I was working with her alone, as many boundaries as we set up, when a person then goes out into society, and the society isn't given a damn around the type of caring boundaries, including law and education, that has to be set, it becomes a constant demand. And when you ask the question, why do women go back? Well, this constant demand too, they go into crisis. And sometimes, I think with Sarah, sometimes I think she felt, well, if she goes in the family and they're controlling her, that's less crisis. At least she knows this crisis. Where out there, she doesn't know the crisis, because they're coming at her in so many different ways. So I think that's another way of understanding why women go back, because sometimes is it less crisis here than it is out there. And that's why we have to know that the culture we live in have a responsibility to care, because outside of that, you get burnout, you get, you know, the negative effect, and it just goes on and just replicates itself. So
the things I've been thinking about as you're talking, Jeanne, about burnout, some things that I really hadn't thought about before, I guess. It's kind of interesting, but burnout, I don't think I got burned out for quite a few reasons. One of them is, as a child, I think I just knew intuitively that there'd come a day when I had to meet a big challenge socially. I had a kind of an epiphany. You know, it says there in the book about me seeing myself as an older woman standing and talking to a lot of people. And I remember watching the Holocaust documentaries and saying to myself, now, if I ever come across terrible things like this was when I was 7. I wasn't like 17, I was 7. I'm not going to turn my back on it. So I can remember when Jeanne came to me and told me about Sarah, because we just started our nursing practice like 6 months before, and everything was just going really well. We were helping lots of people, and they were coming and going quickly. It was we were thrilled. Anyways, as soon as I saw Jeanne, I thought, oh God, this is another whole dimension. Now I thought to myself, am I going to do this or am I not? And I just said to myself, this is that time. This is that time that I was, as a child, committed to. So I dove in 100%. And I've always had a search for something. Like when I was living my life, I always felt there was something missing. Wasn't enough. Like everyday life wasn't enough for me. I didn't feel I could really dig. I love nursing, but I just feel I still couldn't dig into something deep enough. So boys, when I found this was deep as, I didn't have to look anymore for something deep, that's for sure. But I never felt like I was missing out in my life. You know, I didn't feel because I couldn't do this or I couldn't do that I was missing something. I felt this is what I was meant to do. And I was proud of it, and I still am. So I think if you're proud of what you're doing, you'll find ways to not get burned out. You just find ways. You give up a lot, like your house gets dirtier, you know, you have very limited social activities. you know, you just give up on other things because not that I didn't give up on my family. I still struggle to the balance with myself and my family, but this really took over in many ways my life, and I gave into it. I accepted it. I let go into it. So and older women tell us now, well, like I couldn't do it because I would miss doing this or miss doing that. And that's fine for them because they want to go out and go for a nice drive or go somewhere. And I like those things sometimes, but I am just driven to make a difference for children. I really am. And for women. But if we make a difference for children, then they won't grow up to be women that are harmed, you know, if we can get to the prevention of it. So it's just so deep within me that I don't feel I'll ever get burned out by it because I get reinforced by the pride and the satisfaction. And like, for instance, that launch on Saturday was so moving to see women talk and to the doors that we've opened. I just couldn't ask for anything better than that. So I can't imagine me getting burned out now. There was a while I thought wasn't sure I was even going to live or die. I was really drawn into a lot of challenges that I had to deal with myself personally in my relationship with myself and my own emotions and fears and all the conditioning I had and the violence that I lived through. And once I worked through all those, now I just feel like I'm flying most of the time. And I don't feel, and it's a negative, it's a positive, like it's a positive to be committed to this reality because it's important that it be exposed. So burnout's not something I really worry about.
Me either, personally. I've never felt at risk for burnout, really. I think it has to do, like I explained in the epilogue, it has to do with the ability to accept what is and just decide what it is you're going to do about it and decide what you're not going to tackle, I guess. And also the issue is that Sarah's life was Sarah's life. And she had to be responsible. You know, I couldn't be responsible for her life. So I think in some ways that boundary setting, knowing that Linda and I and my relationship with Sarah, we could create an environment where she could learn to decide what she wanted to do. And like you mentioned, April, that a few times she went back to her family and we had very frank conversations with her. Like, if you go back and you get harmed, that's not my doing. We disagree. We think that that's the wrong thing you should do. But, you know, we had to lay the clarity down that that was her decision, that was her responsibility, and she had to decide how she was going to get out of situations that were harmful. She had to learn that. But it is hard to watch women be harmed repeatedly and know that there might be other options. But I think by accepting, yes, I have to accept that that was her decision. I have to accept that she felt that was the right thing to do. We had very frank discussions about it. And I had to leave it there, you know. So I think that for me, I guess that would help burnout. It's not something I think it's a skill I learned very young anyway. I think because I grew up just kind of knowing that that if you know the truth of the reality and you decide what you want to do about it and know that you're being true to yourself, was critical. ethically, and ethically I couldn't be responsible for Sarah's decisions. You know, that's that separation of boundaries. I think those kind of things help burnout. I don't know if this makes sense to you, but it makes sense to me.
And the other
Well,
thing that, oh, sorry, I was just going to say this one other point I think is important because I hear this from other women that are helpers. We have had many, many, many women contact us over the years wanting us to tell them where they have, where there's a counselor that'll help them with non-state torture, where there's a center that will help them, where there's funding, where there's safe houses, all kinds of things. And we've sadly had to keep saying no to all of it, that there's nothing, that all we have is our website. And we can't help everyone that contacts us. You know, we just help certain women who came and prioritized it by what we were doing at the time. We just couldn't help. I mean, we know that there's all kinds of women out there that lived and died probably and never got help. And it's very sad. It's very tragic. But if you stay in that reality and don't take the long view, nobody ever will have any help. So we had to set the priority that we were going to try to move into the social more and get the structures changed and create a space for other women, and like the London Abused Women's Center, and hopefully maybe other centers will take that model on and create a larger framework. Because if we just stayed with one or two women, well, we wouldn't have created enough of a social transformation for the coming generations and the ones that are trying to get out now. So it was hard at first. I mean, when we first started the website and we'd get these emails, I mean, I'd be just sick to my stomach, but I had to understand that I'm doing the best that I can. I'm only one person and I have to survive myself, or nobody will in the end, because we were the only ones doing the work. And to know that hopefully down the road, this won't be the same. Someday we'll be able to say, yes, there's this place and there's this place, but work at it that way. You have to be realistic about what you can do and stay focused on your goals and not get pulled into other directions, or you'll just, I mean, you could shatter. I could have shattered over all this, and where would that have been for anybody?
Amazing. Well, I know, Linda, in your kind of closing statement too, you had mentioned that Jeanne was your rock. Basically, you had somebody else there, and I think that's incredibly important. I know it's important in my life. You know, sometimes whenever you're like, geez, you know, I don't know if I'm totally off the mark with this or whatever, but you have somebody to confer with constantly.
I don't think of her as my rock, though. I think of her as my companion in the conversation. But if any rock that I have, it's me. I'm my rock. But I do need Jeanne to talk to figure out sometimes when I get muddled. But really, that's the most important thing that I learned when I was little, is that I'm my own rock. I didn't know it consciously then, but I certainly learned it through this process, that if I hadn't have been my own rock as a child, I'd never have gotten to where I was to be able to even to consider to help Sarah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming on about an hour and a half, but okay. I do want to touch on just a couple more things, and one of them is more, you know, the whole book. And I know I didn't mention this as a question. It's not much of a question. But the entire book, I kept on going, okay, am I finally going to read about like these torturers getting what they deserve?
That's where we have to have the long view, because, you know, we don't have a law. So if we don't have a law, they're not going to be taken to court because the women are too afraid to go. And that was really hard. I mean, we still walk around and see some of these perpetrators, you know, they're walking free. It was very, very hard, very hard. The only one that I can think of was a woman in the UK. Her perp ended up killing himself because they were looking for him. So that's, you know, that was the only one I can think of, because as an adult she decided to go forward, and I think he knew she was clear enough that he just didn't want to hang around. But no, they're not in court yet because they're too powerful, and they're too, you know, they've got a good cover, good MO. They're not suspected by the everyday person, and the women just don't feel that we have a culture that's supportive enough of them taking them to court. So that's a grave injustice. That's part of our 60-year plan. We're only
And that's-
halfway through.
Yeah, and that's a political cruelty, because without a law, what do you have? You know, they have no justice anywhere, because they're not believed. And I mean, they're beaten up enough as it is, let alone going into court when there's no law that says that would validate them in any way. That's why we talked briefly around having to go to the UN and trying to create a knowledge that torture happens, because without a law, just what I said in the book launch, without a law, there's no knowledge, there's no crime, there's no perpetrator, there's no victim, and there's no data. And I mean, some of this was in all the parts that were taken out of this book, but you know, when the vicious complaints were the alleged perpetrators lodged them against us, excuse me, there was corruption repeatedly in society, even in our community, in our professional association, in the Nova Scotia government. Because when we challenged an employee of the Department of Health and asked her why she lied, oh, sorry, what she did, she went to the Department of Health legal team, and they wrote us a letter and told us to back off. So we were just two people, you know, trying to support the women. Oh, I should have some water. Support the women. And yet we're looking at system after system that is creating roadblocks towards justice. So until that, I've got Coke, if you don't mind me drinking Coke. I have to tell you, that's one sin that I have. When I was writing the book at 3 o'clock in the morning, I had a glass of Coke.
Yeah, Jean's got a lot of problems.
You didn't think you were gonna come on our radio show and talk about all of your
all my
addiction.
problems. Yeah, that's right. The ones I'm not going to give up, my Coke. Yeah, that's why the justice is impossible in that way. But I tell you, there is justice in the book, because like when we describe the conditioning victimization, next to what the perpetrators did, we put in brackets when I was writing, okay, this is physical torture, this is psychological torture. You know, we kept exposing their MO, and that is huge justice, because when you think that society is thinking this doesn't happen, when society thinks the neighbor next door couldn't possibly be having torture parties at home. So they've been invisibilized. So for us, that is a huge justice, to show their visibility, because their prime command, if you will, even torture inflicted, is do not tell what is happening, what we're doing to you. Do not tell. And because society has agreed with the perpetrators not to listen to the women or disbelieve the women, then they've gotten away with it. But in the book, it's for us, that was very distinct. We're going to expose their MO, not get pulled into their psychological and evilism distortions. And we're going to make it very clear that they're intentional, they're organized, and they do what they do for pleasure. So for me, that's a justice that has not yet ever been exposed the way we have exposed it. So if the perpetrators are reading the book, then Linda and I can think of a little bit of pleasure there because they are being exposed. It's like, no, we do not, you're not fooling us. You know, it doesn't matter how many rat traps you put in front of us. We've gone through them and we darn well understand that what you're doing and why you're doing it and the tactics you have. And we're damn well not going to get pulled in to your conditioning. So that was a very strong sense of justice. So maybe you can take that away and think, okay, there is some justice there that maybe people haven't thought about in that way.
There's a few things though, they have no guilt around any, but I mean, it's all pure pleasure. So one woman that one time I was at a conference, it was a survivor conference, and I was standing next to a woman who was a survivor, and they were talking about some kind of a ritualized process. A group were describing it, and she stood beside me and she said, you know, when I was little, I was only 7, and I was in one of these ritualized torture parties. She didn't call it that, but that's what she was describing. She said, the perpetrator looked at me and he said, this is how we trick the fools. Right? And so that's what they think of us. We learned that from listening to the women. They think we're all fools. And most of the time we have been fools, really, because we're believing the pathology. We're believing that it can't happen. We're believing that the women are mentally ill, instead of thinking, oh, you know, these things could really happen. And and that's why we went into the language, because the women were using the perpetrators' language to make them sound crazy. We had to decode the language and change how the story was told to really pull out that it was a torture party. And that's why the language is so important. So they're walking around getting great pleasure in knowing that we're buying these stories. No different than the priests. I mean, look how long we fell for that story, that they were these loving, caring men that were around children. In fact, so many of them are perps. It's unbearable to think of it, really. And they had the perfect cover. Well, they look for the perfect covers. They look for the perfect words and the perfect dress and the perfect positional power and the perfect everything, to focus mainly on how they're going to get their pleasure on the weekend or at night or however they do it. So we have to get smarter than them. And that's why we wrote the book the way we did, so that people can get smarter than them and say, okay, we're not going to be fooled by these MOs anymore. We're not going to be the fools anymore. We're going to start help women decode what they're saying and listen to them and start getting ahead of them. And it will happen. There's no doubt about it. It will happen.
Yeah. And I think one of the issues is because we don't, with the focus on women and giving them shelter, in many ways, the man, what he does isn't broken down. You know, like we made that universal questionnaire with the 48 examples. So it's like, okay, like the 2 women in South Dakota, they could use that and the senators could see these are what the perpetrators do. These, you know, it made it clear. And I think about, if you just talk about domestic violence, we focus on the women getting into shelters. But if we said, okay, this man, this is what he did. And I often think of my father, you know, like, okay, this is what he did when he came home. He did this, he did this. If I could make a list of what he did, and if we started doing that when there's an arrest for domestic violence, even, that this man, he chokes, he strangles, you know, and started listing that, all the things he does, you know, the put downs, you know, the name calling, all that's all those and start making the victimization acts clear, it might put more focus here. But as long as they can escape not being exposed, if you will, point by point, I think then society misses it, because we hear the same thing. I never would expect a neighbor, we have a femicide, a whole family is killed, and you watch the media, and the next thing that the family's saying, well, I would never have expected that. They were the last people to, it's like, I know in the mass killing, gun killing here in Nova Scotia, we're talking about red flags, starting to show the perpetrator's behavior. And I think that's what trauma kind of does, focuses on the person who's been victimized, on them, and it takes away that what we have to do to start identifying the perpetrators. This is what they do. This is how they do it. I remember I was doing my psychiatry intern, and the psychiatrist was up there talking about alcohol being a disease. So I was just a kid. I was 18 or 19. And I said to him, I disagree with you, because if I have diabetes, I have it at home and I have it at work. But I can tell you, my father is violent at home, but he damn well doesn't go out into his workplace and beat up every woman that he comes in contact with. So, we've been able to excuse misogyny, and patriarchy has been able to excuse the perpetrators, in that we don't make them point by point visible. And that's what we learned with the two women from South Dakota, and listening to the conversation that the senator had when he looked at the list and they had identified all the things that happened to them. Well, I can understand that. You're telling me this is what goes on, I think that has to be, we have to think about that. For Linda and I, we certainly thought about it in the book, because we knew that exposure point by point, because we had a discussion that if we didn't keep pointing out the MO, we felt that anybody reading the book would miss the point. We kept thinking, if we don't name this as an MO, people aren't going to get it. So, and I think it's the same, for domestic violence, like Linda was, you can share, Linda, when you were listening to the strangulation, the two questions.
Yeah. So I went to the strangulation workshop, and there was a policeman there talking about how he trains other policemen to not miss the strangulation, because of course it's invisible. You don't often see the marks. And he said that, they have this was in the States, and it was all over the States. They have this assessment of when they go to domestic violence crime scene, and they're talking to the victim. There's different questions to ask. And the two questions they never asked were, you ever sexually assaulted by your partner? And did he ever strangle you? And those are the two questions they never asked. So he'd ask them, why are those questions the ones that you don't ask? Well, they found it embarrassing to ask. That's what the policemen were saying. Police persons. Embarrassing to ask. Mother of God. Like, those would be the first two you should ask. They're the most lethal, right? So it's
who cares if they're embarrassed anyways? Like, get over
this is
it.
This is your job, right?
Worrying about being embarrassed.
I know. And it's not about sex anyways. And they had it sexualized, that they're intruding on their sexual behavior. It has nothing to do with violence.
I know. Well, but that's the thing, right? I mean, pornography has totally murkied those waters. I mean, we've accepted that pornography is a normal course. We have 9-year-olds who are addicted to pornography now,
Yeah.
and where strangulation is just a matter of course, right?
Yeah. And we're
So,
calling it sex
yeah.
trafficking and sex work,
Mhm.
and where torture is, BDSM, and it's all torture. Torture is torture. It's not kinky. It's not BDSM. And the 50 Shades of Grey, all of that really sexualized torture. So we have to unsexualize or desexualize the violence against male violence against women and girls, and that includes the police. But you have a patriarchal, misogynistic society, and so this is why it's very hard to expose the perpetrators. And that's one of the things we really want people to start thinking about their MOs more, so that they don't go under the radar.
But why don't we just wrap up with any sort of closing thoughts, what it is that you really want women to take away from this book. And I'll be able to provide the links down below to how to access it, your website as well, of course. So.
Well, I want women to take away from this. I guess it depends on the women. I think the women that are trapped in non-state torture, I hope they read it and it validates their life and it gives them hope to get out. That's what I hope. I hope it gives them language to describe what's happened to them differently than the pathology language that they've been shoved down their throats. So that for them. And for the bystanders, I want us to get real. We have to get real. We can't pretend anymore that these atrocities don't happen, that they're only in horror movies, or I don't need to watch horror movies. I've heard enough horror in the reality of women and girls' lives. And it's okay. It won't kill you, to believe it and understand it. And you'll survive it. You'll be okay. But if we don't get real, we're going to still be stuck back in the dark ages. I mean, because non-state torture is global. I mean, there's women being tortured in any way you can imagine. And we just have to get real about it. And we have to get so determined that we're not going to be silenced by anyone. And, the men that come along with us, that's great. But if enough of us women really put our foot down and say that this has got to stop, I think we could really shift things. And we have to be very serious about it, because there's so many women that are still silently suffering. It's unbearable, really, to think how many of them have died and never been understood as a torture survivor. And it's a word we have to claim that is happening to women and girls every day.
Actually, I'm having, today when I have the book here, today when I'm working on some PowerPoints for some presentations that Linda and I have this week. And for the first time, I was looking through the pages, and it was the first time that the awareness hit me that I got a sense that what it must be like for somebody to be reading, when in writing the book, I was so intent on the writing, and Linda and I were processing, and I couldn't grapple with what the value might be of the book. I know we had the goal that we wanted to break the silence. So that was achievable. But today I started getting this feeling that people are looking at those pages, and I was thinking that's a new sensation. So what I would ask that people to do is really know that everything in this book is like you say, April, grassroots, and it's true. I want women and men, because men, we've had some comments from men, that it's the truth, and we have to value truth telling, however it comes. And not to be discouraged by the patriarchy, because we're all in the patriarchy, every one of us, so we have to break that. But to know that Linda and I, in writing the book, it was to care about women and girls and children, and what was happening to them. So that's what I would like for them also to take, on top of what all Linda has said, is that the book for us was about care. And when Sarah called that first night, and I said to her, well, I can care about people I don't know, because of course she challenged me to say, well, why do you care about me? You don't know who I am. So I'd like people to know that we wrote the book for that reason too, because we care deeply about women and their ability to speak their truth and to know that they're listened to. And if the book helps them have confidence in themselves and know that they have the right to speak and the right to demand that they're listened to, I hope it gives them that support.
Well, thank you both so much.
Take care.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go get my little dog and have some
Okay.
supper.
All right.
Okay.
Have a
Talk
good
to
night,
the
April.
trees. Talk to the trees and the dog.
Yeah. That's
That's
right.
what I said. Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nice meeting you too.
Thanks for tuning in to another WLRN interview. I really enjoyed my chat with Jeanne and Linda, and I hope you all found value in it as well. Please make sure to check out their website. I have provided all the links you need in the description below. Maybe you like what you are hearing and would like to donate to your community radio station. Simply go to womensliberationradionews.com and click on the donate button in return for some totally excellent radical feminist merchandise. Or maybe you have some time to spare and would like to participate in the resistance against male supremacy. Feel free to send us along your letter of intent to info@womensliberationradionews.com and let us know what you are interested in. I'd like to end this interview with a quote from the book. It is global knowledge that torture is a human rights crime of such severity that it stands alone and apart from other crimes. It must not be that powerless infants are abandoned to be tortured by those entrusted to care for and about them. It must not be that children are told they are lying when they struggle to tell. And it must not be that a woman is told she is crazy when she too tries to be heard. It must be that each and every society, including our own in Canada, stands firm on the legal elimination of torture, regardless of who the torturers are. The non-state torture of women and girls is a crime against humanity. This is WLRN Canadian member April Neault, signing off for now.